Well, thank you so much, everyone, for organizing this event. I'm presenting on behalf of three of my other colleagues, Daniela Nunes from Unicamp in Brazil, Nekia Kwashi from the University of Rhode Island, and Ieda Duarte also in Brazil. So like most of you probably already heard that Brazil is not different from Mexico and other countries, but Brazil actually is aging much faster than even countries that are aging fast. So Brazil actually has the fastest aging process. And the problem with that Brazil doesn't have a very well-organized social welfare for older adults. So most of the care traditionally has been provided by families, right? And many times actually in the context of the household living arrangement. So younger generations usually co-reside with older adults in Brazil and actually provide the care that's needed. However, right, Brazil as other countries, we have been seeing like an increase in the share of older adults living alone. And for many reasons, like fertility has been declining, there is like preference might be changing, family norms haven't been changed with like more divorce and separation. So one of the concerns is like who's going to be taking care of older adults in Brazil, given that we don't have a formal support system in the country, right? So looking at other studies in other contexts, there's some inconclusive evidence whether or not a mortality risk for older adults living alone, if it's higher for those living alone. There is also inconclusive evidence about this gender difference in the living arrangements and mortality. So based on these inconclusive results from previous studies, our goal is to really look at how these living arrangements may be affecting mortality in Brazil and how this might be different for men and women. And not only like looking at how these living arrangements at the baseline may be important, but how about like how the change in this living arrangement may be affecting mortality over time. So to do that, we're going to be analyzing data from the SABE, the Survey on Health, Wellbeing, and Aging in Latin America. The data was conducted in São Paulo, that is the largest city in Brazil. So, like with a grain of salt, it's not nationally representative sample. It represented experience of a large urban area in Brazil. And the data was collected in 2000, 2006, 2010, and more recently in 2015 to 2017. In the baseline, we have a little bit over 2,100 participants. All of these participants in the baseline were non-institutionalized at age 60 and plus. And everyone that had missing data was excluded in the baseline, but there's a small number of individuals. So if we look here at the data, we started with this a little bit over 2,100 participants, and we ended with about 380 people alive in the last wave. So our measures for living arrangements, we're going to be looking at 5 different groups. The first one is older adults living alone, and then those living with partners but no children, or with partners and children. But in these households, we can also have other relatives, might be like a grandchild or the spouse of your child, but at least we'll have a partner and a child. In the 4th composition will be with children, and other relatives may also be in these arrangements as well, but there's no partner involved. And the 5th group that you might be, or the other adult might be living with relatives or non-relatives, kind of like with others. And when we look at the change in the living arrangements in the second models, we're going to be focused on participants that have survived at least for 2 waves, be alive for 2 waves, and we're going to be looking at the transitions between alone to alone, alone with others, remaining with others, or from without others to alone. The mortality data was reported by next to kin in questionnaires, and subsequently was matched actually with the formal national information system on mortality in Brazil. We included other variables that we thought that might be in the process, including aging, schooling, family income sufficiency, multimorbidity, ADLs, and cognitive impairment. I'll be providing some information in terms of the descriptive statistics and some figures based on the Kaplan-Meier survival analysis and Cox models. So just to give a flavor of like, who are these older adults in this sample at the baseline? So most of them were young, right? In the age group of 60 to 69, remember that the sample is like 60 and plus, so over 50% are in the age group 60 to 69. Educational levels are very low in Brazil. So we have 86% of the sample with less than 8 years of schooling in Brazil. 14% already show some data on cognitive decline based on the MMSE. Half of them have multimorbidity, 42% have IDLs, and about a fifth have ADLs. So how is the composition of the living arrangements for this sample in the baseline? So more women than men live alone, but primarily we have these multi-generational households in Brazil. For men, the most common living arrangements is to live with a partner and a child. But for women, it's more common to live with a child, but without a partner, right? And we can think about like how is like the process like with the mortality being differential for men and women. So women will be more likely to be living with their children, only the spouse might have died, but not the case for men that tend to marry in Brazil with women that tend to be a little bit younger than them. So when we look at the sample characteristics, like older age, for example, for women is associated with living alone or with children, or also living with relatives and non-relatives, right? For women, cognitive decline is also associated with living alone or with these other arrangements that do not include partners or children. And among men, it's like older age is associated with like living alone or with a child. When we look at the Kaplan-Meier, it's hard to see, so I apologize, like the colors are not so different, but the top line here is living with partner and child. So for women, the difference is more clear than for men. And the group that have the higher survivorship for women are those who are living with a partner and a child. And the lowest one is for those living alone for both men and women, that is like the blue line. So when we add this to the Cox model, and I'll be presenting only the final models that are already adjusting for age, education, cognitive decline, ADL, and multimorbidity. So compared to those living with the partner and a child, those living alone for both men and women have higher mortality risk, right? So for women, it's like the hazard ratio is 1.85, and for men is 1.42. For both men and women, also living these living arrangements that do not involve partners or children are also more vulnerable and also facing higher mortality risks. So for women, 175, and for men, 151. In fact, for men, these are the only two living arrangements that are at higher risk. But for women, all the other living arrangements, rather than living with a spouse and a child at the same time, actually are at an increased risk. But living alone and with others are like most increase the risk for both men and women. But how about change during this time that we observe in these older adults, right? So if we're just looking at the aggregate level, and here we are only compared alone versus with any other arrangements with any other person, right, that potentially can be providing any care. Both men and women, most of them are living with others throughout the study, right? For women, some started living with others, but moving alone is much more common than for men, and men here are blue, and I'm sorry if this screen is like taking too much space here. I'll try to come back here. But the orange is for women and the blue is for men. So for women, it's more common to be actually alone all the time than for men. But it's also more common to start with others and moving alone. But the primary, like most people actually don't move their living arrangements, and we have very detailed information that I can share later. So, like, there's much more stability than actually we thought we would find in this data. So when we look at change, we were actually looking at this result for a long time, because some of the results here did not, some were in the direction we would expect, but not others. So for men, for example, for those that stayed alone all the time, they have a higher risk compared to men that stayed with others all the time. So if a man was living in a living arrangement with other potential health in their house compared to those who are always alone, those who lived constantly alone were at higher risk of mortality. We didn't see that for women, was not statistically significant, even though it was in the same direction. So even though living alone at the baseline was a risk factor for both men and women, constantly living alone was only a risk factor for men. Now, for both men and women, those who started living with others but moved to be alone actually was a protective factor. And we were really trying to think about who are the selective group that actually made these transitions. When we look at the reasons why people have a change in their living arrangements, and there's reports of that in the SABI data, for both men and women, most of them changed their living arrangements because of the death of a spouse, more for women than for men. But the second primary information that the reason why people are change living arrangements is because of the marriage of a child. So both of them are out of the control of the older adult. So it's less on their choice to be finding a living arrangement that might be more convenient for them, but that many times the change is like outside of their control. And this group might be a group that might be more selective. So we have to dig a little bit further on this data to analyze why these will be protective factors. So this is a very preliminary work, and we're really looking forward to hear your thoughts and suggestions. One of the strengths of this data set is that it has a long follow-up, right? There's no other data set in Brazil that has followed older adults for that long. Because of that, we are able to start exploring the role of changes in these living arrangements, even though we understand that actually it was pretty stable for most of our sample. We have the opportunity to start looking at household composition and mortality in Brazil. And one of the reasons that, because unpaid care is the most important source of care in Brazil, looking at living arrangements is critical to understand the well-being of older adults at older ages, including mortality. The other concern is that because unpaid care is the main source of care in Brazil, there's a lot of potential for unmet needs as families have been changing and reorganizing in Brazil. So what we're going to be doing next, probably many other things that you're going to be suggesting, but in addition to that, we're going to be looking at this preference of the older adults and see if they are misaligned with the living arrangements that we have, because we have reports on what will be their preference. We're going to be looking at other indicators like social isolation and depression. Now, we have many limitations on that, right? We don't know the quality of the living arrangements of the interactions of household members in the household. We tend to think that all being with other people in the household is beneficial in Brazil for the older adults because of support and help, but it's not always the case, and we don't have data on that. We also don't have sources of support of non-household members that we could explore, and we don't know exactly when the change happened, right? Because sometimes we have large interviews. And with that, thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to hear your comments.